Thank you for that very short introduction. I love when that's the case. What a stupid idea to be here presenting after Lydia presented just now. I don't know why I accepted that. It's a completely understatement to say how happy I think all of us are to be here and what a year for equality has been, right? Not long ago, all of us, or a lot of us here, were actually attending the UN Assembly to talk about access to indoor air as a fundamental human right. And out of all the indoor environmental quality parameters, I would never guessed that air quality would be the sexy one, getting all this attention. So that is particularly exciting. I'll be here today with kind of giving this brief that I was supposed to elevate some examples of how to do this and how to narrow down and pinpoint, perhaps to a blueprint of how we can actually inflict change. And because I have no patience whatsoever, I'm always in a hurry and I want things done now. Of course, this is about the commercial building sector in Australia. Why am I talking about commercial building sector? Because we have all the incentives. We have the right maturity level. Every commercial building that is a premium graded building in Australia is basically this amazing organism pulsating with data. Yes, data is not yet accepted to us and we don't have a database that I can play with, right? And spend my days stopping applying for grants to get data and actually using the data that all of you already have. That will be a change. So we have a lot of the incentives. And of course, that always started with this understanding of the business case about indoor environmental quality in healthy buildings and the impact that the quality of spaces have on our life now and over our life, right? So we spend a lot of time, we spend all of these days sitting in a building. Building is a significant part of this conversation. The quality of indoor environments, they should be treated as the most effective, the most important, actually, prevention that one can have in your health over your lifetime. Not only that, we spend most of our day in a building of, it may be your workplace, maybe you're working from home, it may be somewhere. You're always in an indoor environment. And yes, of course, if you're not in Queensland, if you are in Melbourne like me, we spend a lot of time indoors. So what makes the commercial building sector special in Australia? Most of you here, and I don't have to talk about that in those terms because I have known a lot of you maybe for now, maybe 15 years. Is this understanding that what can be measured actually can be managed, right? And then, of course, we have already kind of talked about neighbors, right? This is what we're talking about here. We're talking about mandating equality. And if we look at what happened with energy in Australia, is actually quite amazing and unique by global standards. What neighbors did was to say, hang on a second, no, you have to measure, you have to make it available so there is a public database. And actually, it can't be simulation data. It can't be your intention of your prediction of energy performance. It must be what the building actually consumed over that year. Now, when all of that was implemented, right? Of course, we didn't have all the sensors, we didn't have all the blueprint, we didn't have lots of things, but we had enough. And I think that's where we need to come from. If we're actually going to elevate that to the point that is mandatory, we need to accept that we do have enough, and we surely have enough within the commercial building sector to make the jump. What neighbors did was to introduce what it is they stick, right? And then buildings have to do that. And fast track, right? How long has it been now? 14 years? Am I saying this right? 14 years? Yeah, there you go, 22. I'm too young to know that number. I wasn't doing research in 22 years ago. 42% energy decrease in less than 12 years by the time it actually became mandatory disclosure. Now, we talked a lot about having neighbors as the blueprint and, an example. I can't really think of a better example to actually do that. But when it comes to indoor air quality, what we're measuring is not just as simple as, measuring energy. And I'm not saying that that is not complicated. That's already complicated as it is. But we need to agree, and that has been said many times before, that we need to agree on what we're going to be measuring. The other point that I want to make is we actually have, yes, a blueprint in neighbors, but we have an even more substantial one through the work that the Green Building Council of Australia and the International Well Building Institute has done in terms of elevating, promoting, and creating once again the uptake and the maturity level within the commercial building sector in Australia to deliver some of the very best healthy workplaces globally. This is definitely a contribution that we should not overlook, and then I'll talk a little bit about that work. Well-certified workplaces, because I was asked to talk about perceived productivity today. These workplaces also hold the Triple Crown of certification. They are also NABER certified. They are also Green Star certified in most cases, or they will have some certification from Green Star. They consistently deliver 15% uplift in terms of perceived productivity across the years. Now, if you're a numbers person, you can calculate how much knowledge work makes on average salary, and you can think about if you actually producing a workplace that is delivering 15% uplift, that's your business case right there. We also learned through the Triple Crown certification adoption in Australia that we don't have to compromise energy efficiency to actually achieve that. I think that's a really important message that needs to be promoted as wide as possible, that the two things can and should exist, and we have enough examples of that within the country that needs to be celebrated through those lenses. But the beauty of the return on investment on healthy and green designs in general, which has a lot to do with the quality of indoor air quality that you have, is once you start combining subjective data, which is people data, I don't know why it's qualitative data, it's considered the soft data, which I would argue is the most important data that you can ever collect. When you start combining that with hard data, we can also promote other ways of thinking about the implementation of the cost, which has been discussed and presented today. What we identified as the same workplaces that actually have or consistently delivered high performance in terms of perceived productivity, they also managed to achieve high performance in terms of utilization. Now, building owners who are out there and large tenants who are struggling with work from home mandates at the moment, and you want to invest through an evidence-based approach on the quality of workplaces, these are the type of numbers that they actually listen. Because no one, especially now in 2025, want to be investing on workplaces or strategies for workplaces that won't really have return on investment, considering that a lot of space is sitting empty. So how are we measuring? And no, I'm not going to advocate for more gadgets to be produced and the government being funding a lot of that. But I will definitely advocate for us to go beyond just asking questions, and that is maybe for the academics in the room. We have concentrated for far too long in things around satisfaction with temperature, thermal comfort. We need to go beyond that, and this is what we learned through the research that we do in certified workplaces. In order to achieve those 15% uplift in perceived productivity, you actually need to understand the ecosystem more broadly. But the good news is certification nudges you towards that way. IWBI does that. Green Star has a pretty comprehensive blueprint that can be followed in order to achieve all of that. When we're measuring, so if you're measuring point in time, that's one thing. So if you are using the most sophisticated indoor air quality gear that you can afford, you are still getting top of shelf measuring for 1 point, maybe 5 points across the whole flight plate, and that is done for 1 day, or maybe it'll be about a week. Not only the equipment is costly, and yes, it gives you the best top shelf data, but you also have the human resources that is associated with that to be on site. Good news is we already have mechanisms through the certification to promote the adoption. And can we actually push it harder? Yes, we can. Neighbors Indoor Environment was brave enough a couple of years back to allow for long-term monitoring. And yes, that's the trade-off. You're not going to be getting the best data, but you get large databases that you can play with. What is the next step here? we want to be able to see the data. So we need to remove the barriers through the certification and incentivize data sharing, data consolidation, data disclosure, completely fundamental if we're going to move the needle towards that one. But if you're moving at that point in time, and if you're moving, or if you are measuring just for the specific purpose of the certification, the other thing that you can actually do when you have databases, you can say that you're better than. And that's when benchmarking, it starts to become quite interesting. And that's when data collection over time is so crucial, because it gives us two pieces of information. The baseline data, and the baseline we are prepared to accept says a lot about us, but it also gives us information of the high performance right now in the market, and how we're going to push the baseline to be perhaps a little bit more ambitious to achieve or to catch up with the high performance. When I said I was very surprised that indoor air quality was out of the indoor environmental quality parameters, it became the sexy one. I think all the money in Australia was in acoustic comfort, because this is definitely the one that consistently continues to underperform in terms of occupant satisfaction. Now, if the data is collected over time, that's the other graph that I have out there, that's when you start seeing trends, but you also start seeing change because of an intervention. If you look at satisfaction for indoor air quality in Australian offices, immediately after the pandemic, you can see an uptick with satisfaction. Now, I would guess that a lot of that has to do with the amount of work that was put into a lot of these commercial buildings. Not because people are good, because they're doing the right thing, but because it was in the best interest of the business to make sure the tenants would go back to safe spaces after the pandemic actually started, right? A lot of the investment that was put into that, and you can think about data display, how they were responding to the data that was being collected, that has been collected anyways forever, because any BMS collects CO2 data, how they were actually adjusting on the fly, on day-to-day basis, which, mind you, that is actually what the best building owners, facilities people would do with energy anyways, right? Heck, they gamify that. Facilities would actually compete to the best performance on the day in terms of energy. The same thing happened when it comes to air quality. Who are you measuring for? That's what we hear. For too long, we concentrated in actually having temperature conditions written in leases, and that is to satisfy most of you who is wearing a tie jacket today, likely blue. And that's the reality of our Australian workforce, right? Definitely not suit the temperature preferences of someone that's as small as me wearing a pink blazer. But the reality of this is, if we actually provide access to clean air to all of us, one, we stop depending on this nonsensical approach that is on demand basis. You put in the burden on the person who is already burdened because of a medical condition to have adjustment in the workplace to be able to participate. The same could be said of any other of the indoor environmental quality parameters, yeah? And it should be on you to provide spaces that everyone can access. I think that is definitely a fundamental paradigm shift in the way we manage indoor air quality, and we can actually do that now. Why are you measuring? Is it because you committed to it out of goodness of your heart? Probably no. It's because your investors want that. So what we see in certification now being harnessed to actually comply, but demonstrate what you promised in your ESG reporting. So please your investors on what you committed to. The certification provides you with a blueprint to demonstrate how you got there. And this is what we see in Australia, both Neighbours, Green Star, IWI, all the certification has been now present, and increasingly so. We're going to do a second interaction of that, of how that's being reported back to the investors. So your investors now, with the change in the way people invest money and what they expect from business, are going to be holding you accountable for that. So for the building owners here in the audience, if you're not doing, you're already behind the curve. So in short, what makes it special, and why is the commercial building the best placed out of all the building typologies to actually do this now? Through encouragement from IWI, Green Star, and Neighbours. What's measure and manage? From mandatory energy to indoor air quality is just a gentle push. The data is already there, maturity level, investors, all the investments are there. So overview, sorry, I'll continue to say that until we get this done. What we measure defines the baseline we can accept and we are happy to live with. Our baseline doesn't even exist to start with. We need to get the data that is already there and make it visible and accessible. How we measure, how we triangulate data. Good data is everything. When we measure, yes, point-in-time diagnostic is important, but long-term trends in benchmarking is when you get your competitive advantage from. Who you measure for, central to actually designing and delivery spaces that are inclusive. And while we measure, well, that's where you can make really good investment decisions. And that's what investors are on the lookout. Thank you.